Welcome to Life with Strings Attached. I'm your host, Jamie Gale. Today we're joined by two of the most insightful minds in the study of electric guitar and its place in culture, innovation, and identity, Professors Steve Waksman and Professor Jan Herbst. Steve Waksman is the Leverhulme International Professor of Popular Music at the University of Huddersfield and the award-winning author of foundational works including Instruments of Desire, This Ain't the Summer of Love, and Live Music in America. His scholarship has shaped how we understand the electric guitar, live performance, and popular music history. Steve is also the co-editor of the newly released Cambridge Companion to the Electric Guitar alongside today's other guest, Jan Herbst. Jan Herbst is a professor of music and research coordinator for performing arts at the University of Huddersfield. With a background in guitar performance and musicology, Jan has dedicated over a decade to studying electric guitar culture and technology. His publications include Rock Guitar Virtuosos, Gear Acquisition Syndrome, and his recent higher doctorate thesis, The Electric Guitar in Rock Music. Jan's research uniquely bridges the technical, cultural, and emotional dimensions of guitar playing. In this episode, we dig deep into how the electric guitar has evolved, not just as an instrument, but as a cultural force. We explore how Huddersfield's approach to practice-based research fosters innovation, and how technology and tradition coexist in guitar culture, and why the guitar remains the people's instrument, one that reflects shifting ideals around identity, gender, and authenticity in the global context. From metal's boundary-pushing techniques to the ideological power of distortion, from online communities to sustainability and instrument design, this conversation covers the full spectrum of what guitar means, past, present, and future. It was truly a pleasure to have Jan Herbst and Steve Waksman on this show, and I hope that you enjoy it as much as I did. It was truly a pleasure to have Jan Herbst and Steve Waksman on the show. I hope that you enjoy it as much as I did. Hello, Steve and Jan. Welcome to Life with Strings Attached. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you, Jamie.
Thank you.
Great. It's nice to finally meet you. This is our first introduction. Many of my guests I've known for different ways throughout the years, and this is a real fresh first conversation. I'm looking forward to this.
Thanks.
Wonderful. So we've just read your biographies, so our guests have heard all about the wonderful books you've written and your education. Between the two of you, that's a lot of contributions about music and the guitar.
Yeah, we're busy people.
Yeah. Wonderful. And currently both of you are located in the UK, is that correct?
Yes.
We're even at the same university, although that's only been the case for like 4 months now.
Okay. And you've just relocated, Steve, is that correct?
That's right. Yeah, I was previously at Smith College in the US, in Massachusetts, for like 20 some odd years. But I moved here because I was awarded a quite substantial grant to continue along some of the lines of study that I've been doing around the electric guitar and amplification for the last few decades. And Jan being here had something to do with my coming. You know, we've, as you know, I think this is why you're having us here together. We collaborated on a book together recently, the Cambridge Companion to the Electric Guitar. So now I'm looking more squarely at the history of amplification technologies, and that's what brought me to Huddersfield.
Wonderful. And Jan, you've been there already for quite a few years, I believe. When did you? Because you're originally from Germany, am I correct?
Yes, I moved here in 2017 just to take up the job and focus on the intersection of popular music studies, music performance, and music productions, particularly, which also allowed me to study more aspects on the electric guitar, particularly.
Wonderful. And what is it about this particular university that allows you to study? It's a reasonably unusual topic, is it not, for universities?
It is unusual in certain areas or contexts or whatever. I mean, I've been doing this kind of work for my whole career, and I was lucky to be at a school previously that was pretty supportive of this kind of work. But at my previous place at Smith College, I was like the only one doing this kind of work. And what's very distinctive about the University of Huddersfield is that I'm not the only one now. It's actually a department where there's quite a few people who are thinking about the same kinds of things. I mean, Jan's been there longer, so he can say more about it. But my sense is that somewhere along the way, there was just a decision to make the University of Huddersfield into a place that was a kind of leading university for thinking about things having to do with popular music, and that somehow within that, things around the electric guitar and metal music just rose to the top as an area where there was a lot of shared interest. And it's pretty awesome to be in a place where you're no longer the only one doing this odd thing, but where it's like, oh yeah, we do this.
Great. Jan, can you expound upon that a little more? Having been there for a few more years, what makes that, is it Huddersfield or Huddersfield? What is it?
Huddersfield. The locals would pronounce it Huddersfield, but everybody says it a bit differently.
Okay, great.
But I think what I thought quite remarkable was coming from the German system, where something like practice-based or artistic research is not really an established tradition. It's very much different in the UK. It's not just in Huddersfield, but in the UK, where practice-based research is equal to more like text-based research. And my own background as a performer, I've studied guitar performance, made me quite interested in this kind of area of study. I've shifted a bit less away from performing myself, but my background over many years of studying and performing in various contexts just provided me with the experience and with the interest to study this practice, the art and the culture in all its facets, and the more practice-oriented environment here made this more possible and fostered my research.
Can you define for me for a moment by what you mean by practice-oriented?
So there are two ways or interpretations of this. One is called practice-led, where making music is a vehicle to understand more about music and culture, which is more what my latest research has been. Practice-based, in contrast, is really being a performer, being a composer, being a producer, and the musical output that you produce is the research itself.
Oh, interesting. And Steve, do you have the same interpretation, or would you add something to that?
Yeah, well, I myself, I don't know that I call myself a practice-based scholar the way that Jan was just describing. I mean, I'm also a guitarist. I've been playing more or less my whole life. I started when I was about 9. I'm a lot older than that now. But I'm mostly self-taught. My playing has been a little bit more something I do on the side of my academic work, but as you know, for the fact that I'm here, like I've done a lot of research around the history of the electric guitar. That's one of my main areas of specialization. I wrote a book back in the early 90s called Instruments, or the late 90s, sorry, forgetting my own history, called Instruments of Desire, that I think for all intents and purposes was the first really significant academic study of the electric guitar. And I, completely did that because of my own interest in guitar playing and having grown up reading Guitar Player magazine and feeling like there was this history that people like Tom Wheeler and like some really great journalists had been documenting, but that from an academic point of view, it really was kind of untrodden territory. So my practice as a guitarist is pretty essential to the scholarship that I do, but my scholarship itself is really more traditional kinds of scholarship. I mean, I slog through historical documents. I look for whatever I can find to get my hands on that'll give me some insight into what people were thinking when they either were trying to design certain instruments or certain technologies, or whether they were trying to put them into use. So I'd say for me, what practice means is like, I'm really interested in understanding the practice of other people. I'm really interested in understanding the practice of musicians. I'm really interested in understanding the practice of people who design music technology. Those are not, I mean, I am a musician of sorts, but I'm not a professional. I have a real interest in technological things, but I don't build amps or guitars. I have an interest in getting into the heads of the people who do.
Yeah, there's, as I was reading over both of your bio and your CV before we got into this conversation, I thought, oh my God, there's just so much to talk about. Where are we going to go with this particular conversation? So I think it's going to be easier if we could just sort of pull apart a little bit of your recent work together and then see
Sure.
where it goes. This has always been a conversational podcast. It's not a series of questions, let's say. And so I think you've both got tons to work with. And to be honest, I'm super interested in diving into so many of the topics that both of you have explored in your writing and your work and this work together, because a lot of my work deals with the icon of the guitar, with working with the object of the guitar, not so much of the music specifically made. I'm not a fan. Often people ask me when they find out I'm in the guitar industry, oh,
Hmm.
do you know this person or that person? And they go into the fanhood and the religion of the culture. And honestly, that's not what drives me at all. What has always driven me is the possibilities, the innovation. I didn't learn other people's music. From the first time picking up guitars, it was about what could I do with this? What possibilities are there? And so my niche has been in what I call unique world-class instruments that are contributing to the conversation of the guitar.
Hmm.
And it's what they're contributing to the conversation. Why did you do that? What were you thinking? How did we get there? That has really driven my work. And then about the iconicity of the guitar and the culture around it, which both of you have done a lot of thinking on and writing on. And so I'm excited to go there. But as an effort to keep you tied together, I'm going to pull a few things from at least, of all places, Amazon's description of your book.
Hey, why not?
Of the Cambridge Companion to the electric guitar. It starts by saying that the electric guitar is one of the most important musical instruments and cultural artifacts of the 20th and 21st century. And although I might agree, I would still like you to justify that statement. How do you justify saying it's one of the most important musical instruments, and why?
Jan, do you want to go first, or should I take a stab at it?
You can go first, Steve.
Okay, sure. I guess I'm a little bit more of the historian of us. Um, I mean, on some level, it's like seems like an obvious statement, but nothing like that should be taken at face value, right? I mean, you look at what happened to music over the last century. One of the key, I think, trends is precisely the integration of different varieties of music technology, right? I mean, in my current project on amplification, we're asking a lot of questions about what does amplification even mean? Like what counts as amplification? But whatever it means, a lot of what we think of as amplified music emerged through the medium of the electric guitar. And what I think happened through the medium of the electric guitar as it became integrated more and more into a variety of popular genres is on some very fundamental, very material, very particular level, the sound of popular music changed, like literally changed. You can make sounds with an electric instrument, with an electric guitar that really aren't conceivable or achievable without that interface. And, so the first question is like, why did people feel like they needed this in the first place? And there are different ways of approaching that question. But it becomes really obvious if you really listen to what is the music that people are making with this instrument from around the time it first starts to be used in the early 1930s forward. And it's clear that whatever the practical considerations were, that like an electric guitar makes it louder so that you can be heard better in a large orchestra, right? Like that's one of the common explanations that's given for why there was the drive to have an electric guitar in the first place. But it's a pretty reductionistic way of thinking about it because, not everybody who was playing it at that time was in some big orchestra, first of all. Second of all, whether they were or not, they clearly started to hear that there was a sort of sound they could get with this instrument that they couldn't get otherwise, right? So you get someone like Bob Dunn, the steel guitarist who played with Milton Brown and his musical brownies in the 1930s. And he's making these like crazy noises with the steel guitar in recordings from like 1935, 36. They just sound so different from anything that had preceded them. And I think that drive to discover new sounds is what defined the electric guitar. One of the main things that defined the electric guitar's contribution to music, and it, I think, is a profound contribution. I think it goes along with the invention of the synthesizer. It goes along with the growing trend towards making music that's more squarely electronic. There's just a whole different idea of what sound is and what it can do that emerges through these various technologies. And I think the electric guitar is absolutely central to that larger history. So that's the basis for the claim as I would understand it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I've often thought about the beginning of the electric guitar, as you were just discussing. And of course, there's, exactly as you said, there's lots of discussion about people playing in popular music, playing with horns, they're playing with much louder instruments. How do you compete with it? I mean, the acoustic guitar was trying to compete also with things like banjos in America. And, famously, I think Santa Cruz made a guitar, a dreadnought they called the Banjo Killer. Many, many years later, they're trying to still compete with the banjo on the acoustic level. And that there were a number of iterations made to try and increase the volume of the guitar. I mean, the resophonic guitar was one of those things as well. But each one of these technologies ultimately didn't sound very much like the guitar they were trying to just make louder, if that was the case, right? And so you end up, however, with all of these unintended consequences, like the steel guitar player you were talking about, where we might have just been trying to make it louder, but it didn't sound that way. And often was judged by the people of that day saying, well, it's louder, but is it a guitar? Is it what we're trying to accomplish here? And then that new instrument, however, for a musical explorer, someone who is willing to innovate and try new things, they say, well, it doesn't do what I was expecting, but it does make me do something different. It makes me do something interesting. And that's inspiring. And then they start to create new music. And that new music with that new instrument eventually builds a songbook and a body of work. And if that body of work is successful, now we've created a new musical genre and a movement that can follow with it. But when I try and chart out the evolution of the guitar, and I'm curious to see what you think about this, you've thought a lot about it, and you spoke at Les Paul's event at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and he's one of the central characters in this conversation.
For sure.
Is I plotted out a number of things that said, okay, just inspiration. I have an idea. Now I'll try and make that happen. I have a problem. I'll try and solve it. So that can be the volume issue, right? Mm-hmm. But then there was this third category that developed rather quickly that I labeled unintended consequences. And when I was done charting, the unintended consequences category was much, much larger than the inspiration or the problem. One might say today we're still trying to solve the acoustic guitar problem, and it's our inadequate solutions that have caused the breadth of possibilities, that we still have not been able to amplify the acoustic guitar properly. The piezo pickup is a horribly unmusical solution. It gets us really loud, but it's really not a great solution. Still, we're still trying to fix it almost 100 years later. And so what do you have to say about the observation of the unintended consequences and our poor solutions actually driving inspiration and innovation in music?
Is that directed at me specifically, or?
I am sorry, because I'm responding to what you said.
No, that's
we'll
totally
get you in here in a second, Jan.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're absolutely right, but I think that's sort of true. I mean, I think that some version of that is true in the history of technology more generally, right? I mean, you look at, nobody realized that when they made the transistor that it was going to become the basis for a whole new media reality, right? And by the same token, like the transistor was designed to be an amplifier on some level, right? It's an amplifying device. And yet for a long time, it was kind of bad at actually doing that. It was better at doing certain other things. I mean, I think it's really interesting to look at like the history of the transition from tube to transistor amps and see how uneven that was, even though in like larger histories of technology, the transistor is like the great innovation, right? I mean, I actually have this book on my desk right now about the history of Bell Labs, right? Which is one of the main places where the transistor came out of. And I mean, it's an amazing history, but like the role of guitar amplification in that is a really weird one, and one that most people who tell that history don't really want to tell because it's not so sensational. There's a lot of unintended consequences. I mean, the vacuum tube itself, right? The guy who created the vacuum tube, Lee DeForest, didn't actually think it was going to become the key to like making things so much louder. He was trying to build better radio networks, you know? I think unintended consequences run throughout most of the history of technological development. The electric guitar is part of that history. You know, thinking more specifically about the musical side of that, I think, you know, you've got these inventors who are starting to think about what an electric guitar would be, going as far back as the late 19th century, but it takes an awfully long time for them to figure out what would actually make it work, right? I mean, as you say, there's certain types of pickup designs that work more effectively than others. There's a ton of trial and error. There's a certain amount of intentionality, for sure, and a lot of experimentation. And yet, often I think when somebody really hits on something, it's as much of a surprise to them as it is to anybody else, you know? I mean, Les Paul, for instance, who you mentioned, told the story frequently of how one of the ways he was building towards a solid body electric guitar is that he would like somehow attach a string to a piece of railroad steel, and he would like get a pickup involved in that, and he would have like some really crude version of a solid body instrument. And it was like, this could work, but that's not an instrument, right? It's a piece of metal with a string on it. You know, so there was an intention behind it, but the result was something it took so long for him to be able to actually like realize. And meanwhile, you've got Paul Bigsby working on his own version of that, and you've got Leo Fender working on his own version of that, and you've got George Beecham, who'd already kind of come up with the idea for a solid body instrument when he created the frying pan, which is pretty much a piece of solid metal. So there's unintended consequences. There's also this sort of, I think, recursiveness where people have the same idea, sometimes at the same time, but in different places, and it takes a while for it all to line up. So I think a lot of the invention winds up being at least halfway accidental, you know, but it's people who are willing to keep trying and doing that trial and error that is required in order to get to the point where something actually works. And once they get to that point, then people are like, oh, that could do this, but actually maybe it can also do this. And then there are more unintended consequences, like distortion, right?
Yes.
Nobody wanted distortion when they were first designing all this stuff. And then at a certain point, it's like, oh, that's really cool. Totally unintended consequence.
Yeah. Yeah. The sound of rock music to me is 3 unintended consequences with failed designs. It's the Les Paul, it's the humbucker, and it's the Marshall amplifier, none of which are combined or performing in the way they were intended to. Les Paul was made for jazz players that didn't accept it because it didn't play, it didn't sound, it didn't feel like a jazz guitar. The humbucker was just trying to get rid of that 60-cycle hum. They weren't trying to overdrive or amplifiers and such. And the Marshall was supposed to be an affordable Fender for the UK market. You put those 3 things together, though, and we get Jimmy Page and Led Zeppelin. And of course, many others even before him. But that iconic sound that we think of, you know, wasn't somebody's brilliant brainchild. It wasn't their dream and their vision that said, I'm going to do this and then make it happen. It's a bunch of things being used in circumstances that we didn't yet understand because we weren't trying to achieve those things. And so, yeah, you want to step up onto the dance floor and see what we have to say about this part
Yes,
so far?
Yeah, I mean, the whole conversation had me thinking about science and technology studies where the idea of affordance is very prominent. So where certain instruments or objects have different affordances that allow you to do something that are inscribed into the object, but there are also various other affordances that might be a bit more hidden, but that are available or that might be coincidences when using it. So obviously, once we start electrifying the guitar, we're amplifying it and we're creating distortion, if we want it or not, then we have new affordances that we can play with, and some of them we've already talked about. So we have more sustain. What can we do when we have more sustain? We can maybe assimilate vocal timbre, vocal phrasing. We can emulate string instruments, horn instruments, brass instruments of all kinds. And this has shaped popular music history throughout, as you were rightly pointing out. And I would probably claim that this is one of the major drivers of innovation throughout popular music history, especially when we're looking at guitar history, because as much as guitarists wanted to stay within their own area and just solve a technical problem, which is just how can I be heard better, real inspiration usually happened when they tried to go out of their comfort zone, when they used these new affordances that were afforded by new technology and tried new things. So inspirations from other instruments were a consistent theme throughout popular music history, innovation in the guitar, which I've studied. And you find this obviously early where players try to emulate the saxophone or trumpet and obviously also string instruments. But you see this also in more recent popular history. So when you study maybe the canon, like what players are appreciated and valued highly, then usually innovation is a very important part. It's not just how well can they play, it's also about how innovative they can be, which can be their use of equipment, their tone, but also musical phrasing. And usually these innovations largely result from inspirations from other instruments. And yeah, expanding the technological toolkit allows you also to take inspirations from other instruments and then develop guitar playing as a whole. I think this is something that's worth bearing in mind when we talk about inspiration and the use of technology, the design of technology.
You know, those technologies and the innovation, I mean, they still always happen in a very small percentage of the population. And if we talk about the law of diffusion of innovation, the popular bell curve, acceptance curve, that talks about 2.5% being true innovators and the next 13.5% being the early adopters. You know, this is really still, I mean, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about those innovators being very small percentage of those. Most people are like, that's not guitar. That's not whatever the genre was. You know, that's not jazz, or that's not rock, or that's not folk, you know, and the majority of people have to have, well, that first, what is it, 17 or 16.5% do it first. It's the innovators and the early adopters. And once all of the early adopters have taken it in, then it tips over into the early majority in popular culture at that point in time. And so the way that I deal with this day to day is, you know, one of my businesses is the Boutique Guitar Showcase on tour, where we do guitar events that feature unique world-class instruments that are contributing something to the conversation of guitar. And we take 50 of these instruments to 25 different cities around the world, over a dozen countries and 3 continents. And the reason I started to think about some of these things was when someone stands in front of a guitar and says, well, who's going to play that? Like, they literally point at it, and at first you can be offended. That they're saying, well, that's not a good guitar. But no, they really mean, I have no picture in my mind as to what context this would be used in. They don't know. They don't know who's going to play that. Because we've all felt that, since all 3 of us play guitar, we've all felt the urge that when you pick up a particular kind of guitar, that you're kind of supposed to play something of a particular genre at first. Have you ever had that sort of feeling like, oh, like somebody hands me a 175, I'm supposed to pretend like I play jazz? Like, I don't know. You know, and you have that pressure going on there. And so when they look at it, what they're saying is they have no person to associate this. They have no style of music. There's no songbook. There's no hymnal of this particular church. There's no movement that I'm aware of. And so I encourage them to be curious and to explore. So, you know, all those instruments were like this at some point in time. You know, when the Telecaster came out, it had more in common with a pizza paddle than a guitar. You know, all guitars were hollow, you know, and they had flat tops or carved tops, but they certainly weren't a solid board that you might cut your bread on, you know, or that would have looked absolutely outrageous. And now we call it tradition. But we call it tradition because we've seen so many examples of it, and so much great music has been written on them that there's a songbook established, and most people reenact their heroes. And it's a form of cosplay. that we're participating in a sort of culture and we're reenacting those moments. And we pick up that guitar, and there's many people who play guitar who want to sound just like their heroes. And that inspires a lot of them, but not those early, the real innovators and the early adopters. As a matter of fact, the early adopters are often turned off once it tips over into the majority. They want to be into the band that most people haven't heard of. They want to know about that thing that most people haven't experienced yet. They want to turn you on to something new, right? And it's a bit, it's a bit silly. I'm one of those people where I have to fight my urge to, no, I don't like that anymore. Well, Jamie, you really loved it last week. You're being irrational, but there's an impulse there, right? And so the point is, when you see something and you can't make an image of it, I say, well, pick it up. There might be a whole new genre of music. There's a new song waiting in that guitar, possibly, because it might make you do things that you just wouldn't do on your Telecaster or your Les Paul. And so be curious and explore it. That's the sort of driving point. But that's what made me look at those things in the first place, honestly, was having to stand there and have someone go, who's going to play that? I thought, well, that's a good question. Who is going to play that? And have we asked that before? And so obviously we did ask it many times before. And now we've built up such a body of work around the electric guitar that you two gentlemen are part of, well, basically a society. I mean, this is what happens. So when it blows up, we already have a classical music society. We have jazz societies. We'll have a folk society. We have a blues society. And I think that at this point in time, we're seeing the closing of the main body of work on rock music, that it's sort of wrapping up, that we've said most of what there is to say. It doesn't mean there won't be new music. But the point is, one of the key signals to this is when you start to see teaching it in the university, and if you can go to school and learn about it, and if academics write about it, and if there's experts on the field, then it's reached acceptance within the culture, and then we move into a period of cosplay and reenacting the hero. Does that sound audacious to you?
I mean, I think there's something to that. And it's one reason why there have been times in my own trajectory where I felt a little ambivalent about some of the things that I do, because I don't want to freeze the music I care about in time and make it seem like it's classical in that sense where there's no more room for development or innovation. But I think the electric guitar does have some risk of that in the culture around it. I mean, you're alluding to these moments of innovation, but moments of innovation can then over time become so entrenched that they just become the new norm and the new tradition and the thing that is the standard that everything else is measured by, right? Which we know, like the Telecaster, the Strat, the Les Paul, and a handful of other models are that with electric guitars, just as certain players like Hendrix or Jimmy Page or Clapton, Jeff Beck, etc., are considered that in the realm of musicianship. And there are risks involved in that. And that's actually one of the things I think that our book was trying to address, was this notion that raising some questions about what are the implications of the fact that so many people's assumptions or ideas about what an electric guitar is and should be are already pretty well fixed in stone. Mm-hmm. That there are these models that have become so much the standard according to which everything else is measured. And those models are profound and compelling, and they've become the standard for a reason. And at the same time, as so many guitar manufacturers and designers and people who are engaged with the instrument just keep kind of reproducing versions of that over and over and over again, you do feel like there's not a lot of room for some new creative thought. So
Cedar Creek Custom Case Shop is your premier fretted instrument custom case maker, and we invite you to create a musical instrument case unlike any other, one that's unique to you. Every Cedar Creek custom case is hand-built by highly skilled craftspeople using only select woods, Providence Forge hardware, and premium instrument-friendly materials. At Cedar Creek Custom Case Shop, we are dedicated to helping you design the case of your dreams. Find out more at cedarcreekcases.com. Are you serious about the business of guitar? Then you need to join us on Patreon. We're building a future where guitar makers are able to live prosperous lives making instruments that inspire the musical experience, which helps to create a more beautiful world. Where others who are passionate about the guitar can thrive, those who help in the promotion and resale, trade shows, writing of books and articles are supported as a valuable part of the community. A community where we explore with curiosity and encourage those around us in their endeavors. With a community effort, we can accomplish far more than we can individually. So let's be serious about your guitar business and join us on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Jamie Gale Music. We are better together, so let's do this together. I love where we've been, and I'm excited about where we're going.
I think there's a question to my mind, in the world of electric guitar that's not so unlike some of the questions that exist in the world of classical music, where it's like, well, where is the room for the new? Right? I mean, classical music, I think for a century now, that's been a kind of burning question, where like the repertoire on some level is like already kind of fixed. Like you've got your Beethoven, you've got your Mozart, you've got your Bach, you've got your Wagner. And then there's the new stuff. But who wants to hear the new stuff when you can always listen to Beethoven, right? So it's similar, like who wants to play this weirdly designed sustainable instrument when you can just get your nice Les Paul. And so I think it's really crucial that there's continued work to try to carve out new space, but I think there's often resistance to that. And trying to find the space where the new can be appreciated and not sequestered, I think is becoming more of a challenge than it perhaps should be. In contemporary guitar culture.
See, I disagree, actually.
Okay.
And although it seems like I might
That's
have made a
great.
case to say the guitar is ending,
Yeah.
actually, I believe the guitar is a people's instrument, and the people constantly evolve, and the guitar also constantly evolves. What I mean to say that it's closing is a particular movement. And what's really interesting is that the guitar continues to evolve and create new movements. And I think that both of you have done work around metal and how metal continually pushes and what's also interesting is metal is also pushed by technology. You know, we go lower and lower with metal and higher with these genres, but actually our amplification, our microphones and such, we weren't really able to capture frequencies beyond a certain spectrum at a certain point. And, you know, in our lifetimes, we all sat in a movie theater and heard the first THX systems, and they dropped these super low bass notes and these really high trebles, and the old movie theaters couldn't do that. And once we're able to record those properly, then we have extended range guitars where we recognize the effects of scale length in multi-scale instruments, and then we get into lower and lower notes that once you get the string tension right, they don't flub out on you. And so you can play those, and then they articulate. And both the technology in the instrument, the recording of the sounds, and then the reproducing of those, even just in a set of AirPods that I'm wearing or a set of decent headphones, can reproduce fidelity and articulation in a way that it was not possible before. So the technology moves ahead, and the instruments sort of take up the new ground. And that seems to happen a great deal in the modern musics are taking up the new ground. When it comes to the guitar, it mostly happens in new forms of heavy metal. And Jan, I want to throw this one to you.
Yeah.
What do you have to say about that?
Yeah, that's an observation. I would like to link it with some of the previous discussions, especially you two have been having. I think the movements become smaller and more nuanced, perhaps. So we started with like a whole societal movement where like rock and roll started to emerge in the 50s and 60s, then later metal music. It was still like a very a movement that encompassed the whole society, but then it became smaller and smaller. And when I'm thinking of development in guitar playing particularly, it has become a very, very, or these have become very niche phenomena that might not be apparent to the majority of players. So one of the chapters that I've written in the Cambridge Companion with a student of mine was looking particularly at progressive guitar playing, and most of it is actually in the metal domain, where there are new techniques being developed, like thumping, like butterfly tapping, lots of techniques that probably most players, even that are quite dedicated, have never heard before. So it's becoming less of like a whole societal movement, but it's still development happening in various areas, right? And you identified metal music as one where there's a lot of innovation happening, and this doesn't surprise me at all. So previously we talked about some kind of reluctance or resistance to new technologies when you were speaking about your guitars and we were wondering who is going to play it. I've done bigger surveys on a population of guitar players, and I found quite a traditionalist mindset across most guitar players. But there were clear differences in terms of genre, and usually those that were more open to maybe electronic and digital amplifiers, new guitar models. These were always more in the more progressive metal genres. So these seem to be like the genres where innovation is taking place, because perhaps there's another intention behind the music is maybe to increase maybe heaviness is a concept I've been researching quite a lot, which requires progression in various areas. It can be, as you said, it can be tuning lower. It can be also be playing faster, playing slower. It can be different expressions, and they are supported by various technology. So I think some genres are more driven by some kind of ideological pursuit of some expressive ideals, and these might be kind of creating the fertile ground for innovation to still continue to take place and take the guitar in new areas and new domains.
Do you have an example of a ideological expression that might lead us somewhere, or that you've noticed?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as I was mentioning, heaviness is definitely the one that has been driving metal music for over 50 years. And the phenomena that you've been describing, like tuning lower, introducing extended range guitars, building larger cabinets for your amplifiers, introducing new microphones, that is all part of this trend or of this ambition to create heavier sounds, right? And this merges, especially the guitar, I think, but also other instruments with production. So it's not enough anymore in many genres to just be a guitar player. You need to think about audio engineering. Even if it's playing live, you still need to think about how this will translate to a live stage. And this is why I think the resistance to electronic and digital amplifiers and technology has been declining. I find, like when I did my study a couple of years ago, just the idea of like amplifier simulation or profiling created a lot of controversy. But nowadays, you see them everywhere, and every half-seasoned player is usually open to the idea or even has embraced digital technology. So I think the idea that performance and audio engineering become like one unit of a larger vision is a recent development, and one that I think will continue because we have exhausted some limits on the instrument itself, and for it to be heard and be enjoyed, it requires some kind of technological mediation that requires engineering.
I'd like to respond to that just a little bit, and then I want to throw over to you, Steve, a little bit here with that. One, you made a comment there that it must translate to the live performance, and I'm not so sure about that. I'd like to challenge that for a second. One of the things that I've really noticed, particularly on the metal side of things, is that these progressive players these days, their videos are of them sitting in office chairs or gaming chairs, they would probably call them. I call them an office chair because I'm old enough to think of it that way. They probably think of it as a gaming chair. And, when you look at a Strandberg guitar, Ola Strandberg has a couple of positions cut into the body, and one of those positions is a secondary cut so the body can go to 35 degrees so it can sit in a gaming chair and be played. And that's how they play. There's no strap. They don't stand up. To me, metal was synonymous with spreading your legs, assuming a certain stance, right? Probably throwing your hair around. And now I watch and notice how many of these people are playing sitting in a gaming chair. And it's a very different thing. So I'm not so sure that the goal anymore is even to get on stage. One. The second observation I'd like to make about this is the growing up with computers and the comfort of computers, and that we experience music now. When you look at the three images of us across the screen, all three of us are wearing headphones. Parents don't yell at their kids to turn the music down anymore. They don't even know what they're listening to. Music is intensely personal, not social. Now, it can still be social, but it is increasingly isolated and individualistic in the experience. And so has the guitar playing. So if we're playing and we're recording ourselves and we're playing along, not with a band, but our band is on our computer, and we're already playing in the computer, it's really the recording process. I don't think it was digital amplifier simulation. I think it's home recording. And once the home recording evolved to a point where technology made it so easy to sound like it already sounds in your headphones. Because when you plug into an amplifier, a Marshall, a Fender, a Mesa Boogie, I don't care what it is, a Dietzel, you don't sound like the recording. The recording is a combination of that amplifier, the microphone, the mix, everything else. And actually, if you're trying to reenact a moment from your favorite band, you're much more likely to get there plugged into your computer with a set of headphones on than you are to reenact it with an amplifier. And so at the Boutique Guitar Showcase at the NAMM show, we have 4 amplifier rooms that have a bass amplifier. They have a nice EBS in there. They have a 2-rock great amplifier with a good Friedman high gain distortion pedal. And then we have 2 Neural DSP quad cortexes with headphones. And I've noticed over the last few years since we've had the Neural DSPs there, that there are people of a particular age group and persuasion of the way they're playing guitars and which guitars they're playing, both basses and electric guitars, that they do not want to plug into an amplifier. They've maybe never owned one with a speaker. They go directly to the Neural DSP. And so here we are. So the first comment was about live performance being the goal. I'm not so sure that's the case. And that the second point is that music has gone from a social community that's experienced with at least a few other people in your band or a live crowd to being a very individualistic, personal headphones, computer experience. Gentlemen, what do you have to say about that?
I think there's a lot to that, but I think there's a social component still. It's just that the social component a lot of times is itself online, right? I mean, the participation in message boards, the participation in YouTube channels, the participation in social media accounts for individual guitarists who are posting frequently, like daily in many cases. Like that is social, right? But it's not the social of 4 guys or 4 people, men and women, non-binary people, whatever, sitting in a room together and jamming something out and maybe sharing a bottle of something and or smoking or whatever, right? There's different type of sociality, but I think I was saying before that I see often this kind of strong historicism in a lot of contemporary guitar culture, especially around gear. But there is a countervailing trend to that, for sure, which you've described to some degree, which Jan has described to some degree. And I think the online culture around the guitar pushes that forward to a significant degree. I think, the guitarists who are posting most frequently on social media are typically not the traditionalists, but they're the ones who are most geared towards like, hey, look at this new thing I could do. And then there is a niche, but it's not a small niche. I mean, it's often tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands who are paying attention to that. And then also wanting to know, hey, what gear are you using? How are you getting that sound? Right. So I do think that the social component is still very much there. And I think I actually worry as much about the relative ahistoricism that I sometimes see in online guitar culture as I worry about the over-historicism that I see in the more traditional realms of guitar culture. I think both extremes have their risks. I think I read, I get addicted sometimes in my social media feed to watching a bunch of Shred TV videos or something like that, right? And then I read the comments and I'm like, are you 12 years old? And they probably are, right? Like some of the commenters. But this... there's often like an willingness or an inability to perceive the legitimacy of the stuff that was considered to be virtuosic like 30, 40 years ago that now is not seen to be cutting edge enough. And I think that applies to gear as it applies to technique. And I think there's something very social about that there's a kind of opinion that's formed around these sort of online subcultures where people are really, really invested in pushing everything forward. But then there's a certain sense of forgetting that happens of like, I mean, I get amused sometimes of like, what's up with this Michael Schenker guy? Like, why did people ever think he was good? You know, like that's a comment I feel like I've read. And I'm like, oh my God, I just like want to, you know, but there's always somebody else, probably my age or whatever, who like chimes in and is like, back when he was playing that with UFO in 1978 or whatever, that was actually shred. That was state-of-the-art guitar. This is a continuum, you know? Yeah. I mean, for me, I think as a scholar, but also as a fan, what I'm most moved by is that continuum, is that sense that history informs what is new, that real innovation has to be informed by what came before. It can't just be like a blank slate, you know? So, I mean, for me as a scholar, that's part of what I try to contribute is some more of that historical awareness so that what comes next is informed by what came before. So that's kind of veering in a different direction, but also like, I think the question of like, what is social about guitar culture, like that's taking different forms now. I don't think the social part has just gone away.
Maybe just to chip in, I'd like to draw on one of the books I've published a couple of years ago called Rock Guitar Virtuosos. And the last chapter looks at how professional guitar players or guitar players can make a living out of playing guitar. And what I found is that some of those who are living more in the online space can have as many record sales, as many YouTube streams, even Spotify streams than some of the established players, be it Joe Satriani, Steve Vai, just because they're so present online and their marketing is working so well, to the point where some of these guitar players don't even release music. They're just there because they are representing something, or they can play techniques well, or they can, whatever entertainment value they might have. But then this led me to another area which I've been exploring and also been interviewed about by Guitar World for the second time now, which is like fake guitarists, which is a phenomenon we probably didn't have so much when live music was still more of a thing. But apparently it is quite common nowadays that these online guitar players that are never performing live are faking in various ways, and there are like lots of techniques, and it has become its own kind of culture of kind of discussing guitar culture, but also critiquing it, where people are not quite sure what is actually true, what is authentic. The idea of authenticity generally needs to be debated in these kind of contexts, and I think one of the results of this ongoing movement, which has been for many, many years already, might be that live music might be valued more in the future again, that there might be a return to this. But regardless of this, I think just the act of communicating and discussing aesthetic ideals and values, even if it's only on like solo guitar playing on an online stream, still has the social element to it. So I would agree with Steve that even though the nature of social engagement in the culture has changed, it is still there. It's not people just making music for themselves and just recording in their DAW. It's still very much a social endeavor, maybe even more so because of the connectivity of the internet.
There's proof that there's people faking it. Like they're I'm sorry, this is my first time hearing this. So there are people faking being guitar. And you don't just mean like somebody who's not very good. You mean someone who is coming across it being like very virtuosic. Yeah. And it's cheap camera tricks or smoke and mirrors. Like what is happening here?
It's different areas of virtuosity. So virtuosity is often reduced just to playing very fast or complex phrases, licks, and so on. But it's also other skills that can be virtuosic, like improvisation might be one. So just like there might be posts. This is a lick I've just jammed out spontaneously. This is it, and it's flawless. It might be, oh, I've written this song in 5 minutes. Here it is. It's perfect. This is one area of faking it. But of course, the more obvious one is when you fake the performance itself. So maybe it's cleaner than you might expect. Maybe it is faster than anybody could reasonably do. And what is quite interesting is the extent to which guitar players who are accused go into proving their innocence by maybe having live feeds from a concert again, maybe from the audio engineer who can verify this is authentic footage from the audio console, right? Or maybe having, when recording live with a DAW, putting a timer or a clock to it so you can see it's not being sped up. So the pressure is on guitarists nowadays to kind of demonstrate that what they do is actually real. And I don't think this has ever been the case to this extent in the past. I mean, people were accused of cheating when you put like a sock on your guitar to kind of minimize some open strings when you're tapping. That was cheating in the 80s, right? But this has gone to whole new levels in the contemporary world just because of the digital affordances again, and the area of performance, which is just like at home where nobody can really control. So this is really like a large movement within the guitar scenes where authenticity is being debated and what is and the ethics of guitar playing, really.
Fascinating. The authenticity issue is something that, of course, is a raging debate as artificial intelligence develops and technologies and softwares. We had one of our reels go viral recently with Dr. Gale and Buckwalter, who's one of 25 people in the world that has direct implants into his neural cortex. The only person in the world that has one in the prefrontal cortex. And his head is shaved, and he has 3 large plugs in sort of a cyberhawk, as he calls, there, and that's on the video. And it is unbelievable. There's close to 1,000 comments on this video right now. It's getting close to 2 million views on it. But many, many, many of the views or comments are saying, oh, it's fake. Oh, look the way that, the first plug is not even with the other ones, and no one would ever make them look that way. Well, he's been a quadriplegic for 50 years. He fell out of his wheelchair and displaced one of them, unfortunately, And it is really remarkable to me to see how many people are just like, oh, no, this is fake. This is AI. This is bullshit. And it doesn't take much searching because, this guy wrote the algorithm for eHarmony. He's been a PhD of psychometrics for a long time. There's lots of information out there on him. It doesn't take much to find him. But a very fast response to say this is fake. And it just never occurred to me that, well, I guess I don't spend a lot of time on guitar forums. Sorry.
That might be good for your mental health.
That might be good. But it's fascinating to me because the idea of authenticity actually drove really some of my first observations and why I got into thinking about the major movements of the guitar and the iconicity of the guitar. Because my own experience, just the age that I am, I'm just shy of 50 now. I got into playing guitar and listened to music through hard rock and heavy metal, the late 1970s and early 1980s. And my earlier memories, were all kind of, I guess, fantasizing. I wasn't trying to be evil, but all the bands, they had pentagrams on their bass drums back then. And everyone was singing about the devil, and all the videos, it was Iron Maiden's Number of the Beast and Ozzy and everything back then. Everyone wore leather and diamond studs and sang about the devil. But it was a very short time later that they moved into, like, those same bands, like 2 years later, were wearing fluorescent colors with big hair. Like it wasn't a big spread from 83 to 85 when everyone is wearing these incredibly bright outfits and the singing gets less sort of, about the devil and more about just sort of general culture, and then more about sort of girls and guy relationships. And then they're wearing jeans and t-shirts, and they sort of moved away from that sort of evilness, but at the same time, there was a progression happening where we're trying to play in these virtuosic styles that you're talking about. We're trying to play more, we're trying to play faster, we're trying to sing higher. The drum sets were bigger. There was lots of this stuff going on. And then 90 or 91 hit, and Nirvana and Pearl Jam and Soundgarden came out, and we rejected it all. We rejected all this incredible virtuosic stuff and said, man, that's just not real. It's not relatable. And we said, oh, that grunge stuff, where they might not be singing in tune. The guitar solos kind of suck, maybe on purpose. Maybe they're just not that good. I don't know, but we like it, and it was a real rejection of it. And I had a hard time with it because I was trying to be better and faster. And I didn't understand why they suck. Why are we listening to this? Like as a young man, I appreciate it differently now. But at the time I really could not understand why this was happening. And as an observation, I thought we were sort of moving backwards. I used to call it a rejection period, seeking perfection versus rejection, until an anthropologist at Yale University told me it was dangerous sort of thinking, because I use political terms also. And I turned it into futurism versus golden years. And there's an impulse to go back to the way things were. And there's lots of songs about that stuff. When you hear Don Henley singing, saw a deadhead sticker on a Cadillac, don't look back. Those songs, there's lots of songs about how it used to be better at one point in time. And these cycles that we move through, at first I thought metal went away because, my expensive shred guitar was worth $250 all of a sudden, and those guitars, which were kind of garbage that nobody wanted in the late 1960s, the Jaguars and Mustangs, all of a sudden were valuable, and it was a whole reversal. And I think it was about authenticity. I think it was about relatableness. And there was a period in one of the ancient Chinese dynasties where people would take root structures and rocks and they would put them on pedestals as an example of natural beauty, and to also show their disdain for modern design, that humans could never create something as beautiful as a natural rock or a root structure. And I think that we still do that. I think there's times where we sort of say enough of that, and then we start to hear banjos and gang vocals and singing out of tune, and these things become popular again in music, and the virtuosity kind of goes away. But inevitably, we cycle back towards perfection also. We sort of say, okay, it's time to wash our hair, time to brush our teeth, folks. It's, it's time to start caring about these things again, and maybe I don't want to be that authentic. And we move on in the other direction. And so I think that authenticity is sort of this equilibrium, sort of that we have these tensions between, well, politically, we would say the conservative, conserving what was, and the liberal, so the liberation of the unnecessary, or the things that are deemed to be holding us down or preventing us from moving forward and evolving, and that we constantly sort of move between these two things. And Hegel would have observed this as the thesis that generates its own antithesis, but eventually forms a synthesis, which then becomes the new thesis. 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but a forward momentum the whole time. And I think that we do this in our culture, and we see in guitar culture. And so right now we're in one of those periods where the traditional electric guitars that you were talking about, the Les Pauls and Stratocasters and such, I mean, there's a ton of them in the marketplace. The value's way down. Music stores are buying collections, not guitars. So the stores that are buying vintage guitars are buying someone's collection. They're looking to buy 20, 50, 100 guitars, not one guitar. But brands like Strandberg and Dingwall and Neural DSP are reporting double-digit gains year on year. That's that future forward thing. I think we're in that part right now where the one movement is closing and the other one is tipping over into popular culture. But that also ties into this authenticity, which I think moves in about 11-year cycles, by the way, which also seems a bit crazy. But so what do you have to say about those observations as they relate to your own work? Because both of you have done so much writing on the guitar.
Well, I mean, authenticity cuts in a lot of different directions, right? So you were making that distinction between like the sort of conservative and forward thinking, and then also the like kind of perfectibility and the kind of pushing away from that to something more maybe natural or real. I mean, another area where I think there's a kind of comparable tension. I mean, I'll kind of refer to myself. I'm a little older than you. I'm in my late 50s. But a lot of the stuff that you described about your kind of pivotal moments of being into music and feeling things transform, I relate to that. I mean, I'm an old Gen Xer. You're a younger Gen Xer, right? So I grew up with Eddie Van Halen and that generation of guitarists who were trying to push the envelope on technique. And, you know, Yngwie Malmsteen and the whole generation of shred guitarists. But I'll say for myself, you know, I started reading Guitar Player magazine when I was around that, like, when I was a teenager. I think I started really tuning into it around 1984. I was about 16 years old. And one of the things I got from Guitar Player that really stuck with me, and it informs my way of thinking about the guitar's history in a pretty profound way, I would say, is that as opposed to some of the other magazines that were around the same time or a little later, like Guitar World or Guitar for the Practicing Musician, where it was much more squarely, I think, focused on metal and on that particular way of pushing the technical envelope, Guitar Player was a lot more kind of inclusive, I would say, in terms of style. Like country guitarists, jazz guitarists, blues guitarists, free improv jazz guitarists were all equally legit. And I took that very seriously. So while I was into metal very much and was trying at times to, you know, I learned how to play Eruption from the Guitar Player magazine issue where Eddie himself, no, it was actually Steve Vai's transcription, right? Steve Vai did a transcription of Eruption that appeared in a Guitar Player from '84. That was how I learned how to play Eruption. But I also was really tuning into all these other styles. So for instance, I remember Guitar Player had a profile of the free jazz guitarist Sonny Sharrock, right? Who was just like a very noisy, very experimental guitarist who at that time, this was in the 80s too, he was already like kind of old, not a young guy, but still cutting edge. And then on the other hand, you had something like Sonic Youth, which is like pretty noisy, experimental indie rock. So I think that one of the things about authenticity is like, it's a bit of a moving target, right? So if you define authenticity as a certain type of like very refined, precise, technical, well, actually, you were kind of saying the opposite, that authenticity is like not the precise technical stuff. It's like this other thing that's more natural. But then where does somebody like Sonny Sharrock fit into that?
It's both. I'm saying we think that one is authentic until we say that's so polished it's unbelievable. Right. And then comes the folk movement, then comes the punk movement, then comes the grunge movement, then comes the MTV Unplugged movement. It's sort of the antithesis of the thesis that things should be perfect. And then the new thesis becomes perfect is bullshit, and that imperfect is where authenticity is. But both are people seeking authenticity.
I think that's right. But sometimes I think the authenticity can come precisely in appreciating the variety and the diversity of expression too. Like that's a different kind of authenticity. But I think it's an important one, right? Because I think there's a risk when authenticity becomes very black and white, when it becomes like, this is the real thing and this is absolutely not the real thing, you know? And so what I took from that pluralism that Guitar Player modeled was like, there's a lot of real things. There's not just one. And it doesn't mean there's not still a desire for something real. It's just that it can take a lot of different forms. I think to me, that's a much more compelling and persuasive way of thinking about how to make those value judgments. But they're still value judgments, right? I mean, there's killer, like bluegrass, shreddy stuff that's lives in a completely different world from the killer metal shreddy stuff. Yeah. But they're both equally compelling and amazing and like can blow your mind, right?
Yeah, in an 80s context, it's who's better, Steve Vai, Stevie Ray Vaughan, or Alan Holdsworth?
Right.
It's like, how do you...
Why not all of them?
Yeah. How do you judge that competition?
Exactly. Yeah.
the popular vote is how it generally goes. But yes. Yeah. So Jan, do you have something to say about authenticity and how it affects?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, because we've been referring to age quite a lot throughout our discussion regarding authenticity, but also generally like our experiences, where we were in life, and how our current age influences the way we look at things. And I'm just wondering if also regarding authenticity, generational aspects are there. And I'm looking more maybe again at the technological side. Like when I started playing guitar and still till now, for me, it was very important to play like valve or tube amplifiers. I've got like more than 10 different ones at home. I've got different cabinets with different speakers. And this was always very important to me as my in my identity as a guitar player. But you were saying like when you're at like a NAMM show, then people gravitate towards the digital devices, even though they're still hardware in some cases, or some of them are even software now. So there seems to be a different way of viewing or evaluating authenticity. So when I'm speaking with my students, for example, many of them are students of audio engineering, music production, and so on. They don't even think about recording real amplifiers anymore. Same with a drum kit, if they're doing like their final year project where they spent a whole year writing music, recording it, and saying this is like what I've learned throughout my whole university course. They don't think about it this way. They don't think it would add anything having recording a real guitar amplifier, recording a real drum kit is not really what matters in their evaluation of music. So clearly there's some kind of trend or shift happening, and I'm not sure if this is going back, like you were saying, this like 2 steps ahead and 1 step back. It will be interesting to see. But in the last 7 years or so, I've been teaching here the more practice-based courses. I've seen a trend away from all these more like authentic technology, like amplifiers and drum kits and bass amps and so on. So it will be interesting to see if there's a more radical shift happening now. You mentioned AI is a very significant societal shift. So I wouldn't be surprised if we kind of disrupt this established pattern of 2 steps ahead and 1 step back, and there's like a reset to authenticity, which might be more like generational or along other socio-demographic characteristics.
Mm-hmm. I think it was Egerton who said that nobody wants your drill; they want the hole. And I think that your students, so it doesn't really matter the system of. We want that sound. we want the recorded song. I don't really care about your drill and the process of that. I want the result in the end. I want the whole.
And the aesthetics as well. I mean, it's not just that they have an idea of how their song is supposed to sound when it's ready. I mean, you were saying earlier, like they want to plug in their guitar and they want to have the album ready sound, right?
Mm-hmm.
But they actually prefer the sound out of the box. So like it's the same for guitars as it is for drums. It just sounds better to them, to many of them. I'm generalizing, but I think there's a shift in aesthetic appreciation.
I think we're dealing with iconicity at that point, right? Yeah. There is a sound that is supposed to happen, and we would all agree that if there's a pedal or an amplifier that has settings on it, and one says blues, one says rock, one says metal, we all know what those are supposed to be like. If they don't sound like that, we would all be like, hey, come on, guys, that's not a blues sound. Or we would say, because the icons have been established. And so when you're dealing with somebody who is trying to make a recording and they have a certain idea in mind, if it's a series of icons and they're just building with the Lego bricks of iconicity, we put in this icon with this icon, this icon, then you can get them to the result that they're looking for. Yeah. But one of the things when we're talking about experimenters, though, and innovators, is some of the really great sounds that we've had have been very unintentional. I think I was hearing a bit of the story of Mark Knopfler's line at the beginning of Money for Nothing, and that something had fallen over in the studio. The mics were actually not in the intended place at all. They recorded it. They're like, that's fantastic, except they couldn't necessarily recreate it. It was actually kind of an accident. And there's an interesting way that when we understand our equipment as experience filters, then we can choose to imply icons and systems. But there's also there's a Polish design company who makes a stool called the Plop stool. I don't know if either of you are familiar with the Plop stool, but it uses this concept of controlled loss of control. And so it's two pieces of sheet metal that have been welded all the way around the edges only. And then they use some sort of explosive to blow up the sheet metal from the inside. And it pops out to a three-dimensional form that they then bend down the legs into a three-legged stool. But each one is somewhat different, yet somewhat the same. So it's a controlled loss of control. And I think that there's a certain amount of, you can make the choice. This is, again, that seeking perfection or seeking something a little more unperfect, that we can say, well, how about we intentionally lose control here a little bit and shake up the filters so that we get a different kind of result. You know, choosing to plug into a Marshall versus a Fender is a choice about your experience filter. You're going to have a different experience because of your choice there. And I think there will still be people who make the choice to plug into older technologies because it's an experience filter.
Cedar Creek Custom Case Shop is your premier fretted instrument custom case maker, and we invite you to create a musical instrument case unlike any other, one that's unique to you. Every Cedar Creek custom case is hand-built by highly skilled craftspeople using only select woods, Providence Forge hardware, and premium instrument-friendly materials. At Cedar Creek Custom Case Shop, we are dedicated to helping you design the case of your dreams. Find out more at cedarcreekcases.com. Are you serious about the business of guitar? Then you need to join us on Patreon. We're building a future where guitar makers are able to live prosperous lives making instruments that inspire the musical experience, which helps to create a more beautiful world. Where others who are passionate about the guitar can thrive, those who help in the promotion and resale, trade shows, writing of books and articles are supported as a valuable part of the community. A community where we explore with curiosity and encourage those around us in their endeavors. With a community effort, we can accomplish far more than we can individually. So let's be serious about your guitar business and join us on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Jamie Gale Music. We are better together, so let's do this together. I love where we've been, and I'm excited about where we're going.
What do you think, Steve? I know you're doing a lot of work right now on amplification and technology. So,
I mean, I think there's absolutely, I don't envision that the old models are going to just wither away and die. You know, I mean, I do think that the old companies always have that pressure on them to continue to have at least some sense that they're doing something new and not just, you know, running on the fumes of their past success. But they have, I mean, partly it's about brand identity, right? So it's something kind of basic about that, but it's also about the fact that those sounds are so baked into the culture now, and why wouldn't you want to continue to have access to that and be able to reproduce that? It's a classic sound for a reason. And there are things that you can, you know, just because it sounds just like X doesn't mean that that's all you can do with it, right? You can still play things with it that might take you in a different direction, even if you're dialing in that exact same tone that somebody else also used. But I think that also, you know, sometimes the innovation, you're talking about, again, the unintended. I mean, one of the things I was thinking about as you described that, you know, so it's also links to some of our earlier conversations, like you go back to the early history of rock and roll guitar, and a lot of stuff was happening that was very explicitly accidental, at least according to legend or myth, right? Like the story I like is with the recording of the kind of proto rock and roll song Rocket 88, right? Where they're on the way to the studio. It's like Ike Turner and his band. The guitarist amp falls off at the top of the car, right? Speaker cone breaks. This is Willie Kysart. He's the guitarist. And they get to the studio and it's like, oh, the speaker cone's broken. It sounds kind of gnarly. It's like, it's distorted. Like, what should we do with that? Like, that's not the way we usually want our amp to sound. And Sam Phillips, the producer, is like, that sounds interesting. Maybe we could do something with it, right? And then you get this like fat distorted bass line that's like plays under the song, and it's like distorted rock and roll guitar is kind of not, on some level born, although it's being used as a bass line, which is really interesting. It's not like power chords or anything. That comes maybe a year or two later. But I mean, another thing is like sometimes the most innovative stuff doesn't require the most innovative equipment. I mean, I was thinking of Tom Morello, for instance, right? Thinking of somebody who pushes the envelope on sounds. But, what Tom Morello does with the pickup selector switch, right? Like so many of the effects he gets are just from like turning down the volume on one of his pickups and then just wiggling that toggle switch back and forth. We've all done that, right? Any of us who have like a Les Paul or like a guitar where you can kill the signal on one of your pickups, you do that because it's kind of cool. And there are, lots of examples of recordings where you hear maybe like Alex Lifeson of Rush or Ted Nugent or whomever doing something with that. But there's something about the way that Morello uses it where it becomes a whole other thing. Like you would never say like, oh, that's just some guy with a toggle switch playing around. It's completely low tech, and yet sound wise it's completely high tech. It like makes it sound like something new, right? So I think you're absolutely right that the equipment is like a thing that presents you with a certain framework of experience, but I think there's still so much that is variable about what you decide to do with that, right? Like you can think outside the box with the most conventional stuff imaginable, and you can still come up with something new.
There's the synthesis, right? So if you look at a modern player, let's bring things ahead by about 3 or 4 decades for a second.
Hey, why not?
to Tim Henson, and when you watch Tim Henson play, he's moving between R&B lines and metal lines and flamenco lines like very fluidly, as if they had been mixed by a producer, because no guitar player would ever try and do that. So he's a guitar player who's playing like a modern producer has put together the like literally cut and pasted guitar lines together, but he pulls it off in a live setting. Unless Jan has something to tell me about Tim being one of the one of the guys out there faking it, but I do remember him making a video where it was like he plays it live and watch, he does it without the edits,
yeah.
But that is none of those individual things are particularly new or innovative. It's his synthesis of the styles and blending them together that makes it particularly original for him and his style. To your point.
And I think that's an example of what I argued earlier, that guitar players move towards engineering and production. So I think this is a very clear example where there's like a feedback loop where then producer activity and experience feeds into guitar playing again and is shaping it. So it becomes more than just like a performer or like a composer, but it's more like about shaping a musical idea, and they use whatever it takes to make this work. But I think what I would say, returning back to the idea of kind of going out of the established conventions and seeking like unexpected occurrences, I think this is a lot about like motivation, what players seek. And I would still say that generally guitar players are not prone to do this as much. So most of these historic examples we've been recounting were lucky coincidences, where an accident happened and suddenly there was a discovery, but it was not something that was actively being pursued. And I think here the guitar community and culture differs from other cultures, and I'm thinking of electronic music as a much more progressive culture. And an early example, it's not even that early, but a very famous example is, of course, Brian Eno, who set up various musical devices, sound generators, effects, units to create music that had some control or some parameters controlled by him, but the rest were completely random and just interactive between the components, right? And this has been developed further and further in electronic music, taken into like the modern digital production environment. But it's a lot about creating or taking control away from the musician, from the composer, from the producer. And this doesn't happen so much in the guitar culture. And I'm wondering if the reason is because we're still playing an instrument. We need to have command over the instrument. We pride ourselves on learning the instrument and playing it to perfection. And maybe this is what is holding us back as guitar players, and not kind of giving up control and outsourcing it to maybe other devices, to technology, and have this a larger part in the musical outputs that we are creating.
Okay, let's challenge that for a second. So I think in order to make your case or possibly disprove your case, we have to define the guitar. As the same, you've given an affordance to a synthesizer or as in electronic music in some way. How do you define the guitar differently that you think is a limitation versus what's happening in that electronic music? To me, they're both interfaces. They're both mechanical interfaces. So why do you think the guitar is inherently limited somehow?
Not necessarily. I was aiming more towards the mentality or the ideology of players, and I think it's more about the notion what is playing a guitar. We have a physical instrument, we can feel it, we can feel the strings, and there's a direct connection to everything that we're doing, which is not that obvious on an electronic instrument. And there might not be an instrument at all if we're like producing electronic music in a computer. So I think this interface, as you say, lends itself more to control, because we are kind of enculturated to have this direct connection, and we are learning an instrument play maybe along similar traditional lines of like other instruments. Maybe some people have learned the piano before, so you kind of know like certain movements, certain ways of playing, certain techniques. And the same is true for the guitar, where we kind of learn certain techniques, and we have certain mental representations, and we might limit ourselves by sticking to those and not breaking out of those possibly. This is just a theory, not something I've thought about too much. It was just something that I was thinking about during our conversation. But I'm wondering if it's more a mindset rather than the affordance of the instrument itself.
I mean, I was thinking as Jan was talking about that, about Robert Fripp, who is, of course, one of Eno's primary collaborators, and who is a guitarist who I think has put some of the same impulses Jan is describing into practice. I mean, I do think there is an experimental tradition in guitar culture that has been willing to take more risks in terms of what it actually means to play a guitar, thinking about the guitar itself as an instrument, kind of expanding the approach to the instrument, whether that means actually redesigning it or whether it means just kind of like taking it apart mentally. But I think Fripp is a reasonably popular musician, but also a bit of a cult figure, right? And then there are figures who are more squarely experimental and quite underground, whether you're talking about someone like Derek Bailey, whose approach to playing guitar is just so singular and against the grain of what is conventional. I mean, he barely plays straight notes, or played. He's been passed away for quite a few years now. Or a guitarist who I really find quite compelling, I don't know that he's still around, named Hans Reichel, who built these amazing instruments that had necks going out on either side. But he's, not doing the sort of shred thing of like, look at me, I can like play arpeggios with both hands. And he's instead creating soundscapes, like doing things that are much more like, this is an instrument that isn't just about trying to play streams of notes, but trying to develop, again, that notion of like trying to discover sounds that you wouldn't otherwise be able to find. I mean, I do think that there's a strong tradition of that in the history of the guitar and in current guitar practice as well, but it's always a little bit more of an underground tradition, at least in my awareness of it.
Mm-hmm. I've been thinking about this definition of the guitar. It's one of my habits. I'm not academically trained in what I do, and so often there's just very simplified versions of things that help me sort of frame the world. And I think, I often quote Konstantin Brancusi when he said that simplicity is complexity resolved. And so it is my habit to take the complexity and try and resolve it to the simplest forms possible. And when I think about the guitar, a few weeks ago, I was considering it as simply as a mechanical interface. That's a system of, it's a chordophone, it's strings. And those strings, basically going back to the thinking of Pythagoras, that a different length of that string, at a particular tension, is a different note. And that's what we use our frets for. Or you can use a fretless instrument as well. There are fretless guitars and basses as well. But you're basically using your finger against some object to change the functioning length of the string for the note. And then if we take that, we think, the pianoforte, the harpsichord, the organ, the modern synthesizers, these are really still a series of whole tones and semitones arranged in, both size and pattern, usually of black and white. Normally, I know there's some exceptions to that. And that's a mechanical interface. It used to have it's a percussion instrument in the traditional sense because of the hammer action. Although I don't know that we call a synthesizer at this point in time a percussion instrument anymore, but its origins are there. And it's just a mechanical interface. Same thing with a reed instrument or a horn instrument. There's a reason an alto sax player can pick up a clarinet and they can do something because they both have the same kind of reed and they both have keys in roughly the same sort of positioning. And so, do we really just have groupings of mechanical interfaces? And once you learn that mechanical interface and your proficiency of that mechanical interface, what we take that, what we do with that is maybe the leading edge of that is what you were talking about, Jan, with electronic music, is that there's no reason that any one of those iterations of interfaces, mechanical interfaces, can't be translated then thereafter in a digital format. But what is the use of the interface? It's an extension of our body and it causes us to, again, filter that experience. The chordophone, the guitar in particular, or iterations of the guitar, are because we really interact with that string, like in multiple positions, with both hands typically. And so we have a way of manipulating and extending our body, which is quite different. The human ability to take a screwdriver and feel what's at the end of the other screwdriver, to extend our body beyond our own physicality, our own biology, that we can take an instrument of some sort, whether that be a screwdriver or a guitar or a piano, and extend our human experience, our sensory experience beyond, and then manipulate our world and the energy around us. I don't know that we can't go there with a guitar in the same way that we've gone there with keyboards, or, a DAW is, as long as we can send it a signal. Is it still a guitar at that point? I've said a lot. That was more of a stream of consciousness than a question, gentlemen. But do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, one of the things I've been thinking about in this train of conversation, this question, what is a guitar, or what makes a guitar a guitar? I wrote a piece a few years ago about the guitar synthesizer, like the kind of evolution of it. And I think it's an interesting example of a lot of the stuff that we're talking about. It was very much geared towards wanting to take a more innovative approach to the guitar, both at the level of design and at the level of sound production. Many of the musicians who were most drawn to using it, people like Alan, some of them have come up before, like Alan Holdsworth, Robert Fripp,
Adrian
John McLaughlin.
Yeah.
Right, right. So it had a very innovative cast. The two areas where you found it most often were like prog rock and jazz fusion, both areas where I think there's musicians who are often trying to push the envelope. And people did some pretty cool stuff with it. And there were instances with like the particular instrument that Holdsworth liked to use, in particular the syntax, I think was a really interesting instance of like raising some basic questions about what is a guitar, because the strings on it were not strings in the traditional sense. They were really just sound triggers, you know. And the whole instrument was basically like a MIDI trigger, but it had an interface that was string-based rather than keyboard-based, so it wasn't like a traditional synth. But it was definitely not a traditional guitar. It kind of didn't matter where you fretted, or you could program it so that like where you put your fingers on the fretboard would have some correlation with some kind of pitch, you know, relationships, but you could program it, like it could be basically whatever you wanted it to be. It was a pretty dramatic reconfiguration of the physical dimensions of what a guitar is usually thought of as constituting. You know, it didn't take off, and that to me is really an interesting part of the whole thing. It's like these instruments satisfied a need. There was, or a desire to precisely push the envelope in the way that I think we're talking about now, a desire that some musicians and some designers had to try to reimagine what this instrument could do. But most people found it to be prohibitive for one reason or another. It wasn't something that the average player felt was something they had the desire to engage with, at least not at that time. You know, so there are certain players, like some of the ones we named, Pat Metheny's another one, who really demonstrated like, oh, you can take this thing and really like do some amazing stuff with it. Part of it was about price, right? I mean, that's something we haven't really talked about, but I think sometimes when those things that are really new come out, it's like, are they accessible, right? There's a real difference between the innovation that, you know, priced at like $750 and the innovation that like the synclavier, you know, like, which was an interface that the Metheny was really drawn to back in the late 70s, early 80s. I mean, that cost like $500,000 or something like that at the time, right? Who was going to even be able to afford that except for like the most higher echelon players? So I think that's another facet of innovation that we haven't really talked about so much, but like it has to be accessible or else it's just not going to be meaningful to the majority of players. But I think it also raises a deeper question of like you were saying before, like there's a sort of threshold of how many people are really interested in pushing the envelope, right? And pushing the envelope can look like a lot of different things. It doesn't, I mean, the music of a lot of these people that we're talking about isn't that esoteric. I mean, Adrian Belew is not, to my mind, a very esoteric musician. Some of his stuff is incredibly accessible and fun and enjoyable. I would say the same for Metheny or any number of other players who were drawn to these more innovative tools and were doing innovative stuff while still making it into something that an average person might actually enjoy listening to. But whether the average guitarist felt like they could take that extra step of like, I want to also do that. I want to play that. I want to sound like that. That was a step too far for a lot of players. So I think that question of like, where do you hit that sweet spot where an innovation seems like something more people are going to actually want to be part of versus a thing that's like, that's sort of cool, but yeah, okay. I don't know that I need to do that myself. I think it's hard to define where that line is.
Yeah. On the manufacturing and accessibility side of things, I touch on this as one of the key things with multi-scale instruments in an article that I wrote called Tipping the Scales that was published in guitar.com, and it's also on the Boutique Guitar Showcase website. You can go there and see it if you'd like. But it does talk about the accessibility of multi-scale instruments and that the price points, you know, are still quite high compared to what most people's first guitars or even lifetime guitar, frankly, for many guitars. And the price points are coming down on them. And so when you're standing there and you're able to make a choice between one or the other, when you first start to develop your habits, it's going to make a big difference, you know. And yeah, of course, the same thing with technologies. You know, everyone talks about not everyone, many people, and are those of us who are in the music industry who have many musician friends see lots of talk on social media about how they don't get paid for their recordings properly and everything. It's a big debate. AI has further heated the debate as to how you're going to make money selling your music. And have a fairly unpopular opinion on the matter, but the reality, we took all the money out of the music system. The same people that are complaining they're not making money in music are at home recording it on their laptop. When you watch Bohemian Rhapsody, you watch the band sell their fucking van to get one shitty overnight recording session. That's what it used to take. You had to put you had to have real money, and you got the worst time slot. I've been in those overnight recording sessions when I was young. I know exactly what that was like, and you had a window this far. Why? Because you ran out of money. But it was never the musicians that were making money. It was always venture capitalists who said, hey, kid, you sound pretty good. I bet you, here in Memphis, you're really good. They've never heard you in Chicago or New York. I'll pay for a record recording if you'll give me the exclusive rights to sell it. That's what the record industry was. And there's no longer the studio. There's no longer the mixing console. You're recording everything on a $1,000 laptop at home. You're not paying an engineer. You're not paying the studio. You're not paying the distribution channels. You're putting it out to the world for free, and you're wondering where the money is. Well, you just need a really, really basic introductory course in economics to understand where the money is. You're not paying into the system. There's no money to take. Now, I might get lynched for this little speech, but but that's the reality of it. So musicians have to, if you want to make money making music, you're just going to have to be creative in some other way to make it sort of happen. But it was always a distribution cycle. And the distribution changed constantly. It wasn't that much of a period in history where you could make money. And honestly, almost nobody made real money doing it. A very, very small percentage did. But now we have accessibility to the recording platforms at a very low price. Let's tie this back together. And now we have incredible global distribution. I mean, you can record something today and have it uploaded and distributed to the entire world within 24 hours. That is bloody incredible. But it also goes against the basic laws of economies of supply and demand. If it's easy to get, easy to do, it can't be worth a lot. That's just the way it is, right? And so on the technology side, and as far as a guitar is concerned, I make a case that the multi-scale guitar is a functional improvement that we can't ignore for very long, and that the mechanical box saw solution of how to put frets in, that's not how a violin or an upright bass or any fretless instrument intonate. They don't intonate squarely across 6 strings of different tensions and thicknesses. It's just not the reality of it. It's a crude old solution that's outdated now quite a bit. And now that we cut fretboards on the CNCs, it's really hard to make an argument as to why we should continue to make a parallel fret. It's just a matter of time until the parallel fret more or less tips off, except for reenactments. For those people who want to ride a loud Harley Davidson with leather vest and aviator glasses, you can play a parallel fret guitar to reenact a period of music someday down the road, but future generations won't accept the limitations of it. We'll all be playing multi-scale guitars one day.
I can't say I've played one. I have to admit the thought of it on the surface is a little bit daunting.
Every piano's multi-scale, every harp's multi-scale, like a violin is multi-scale. Just get it out of your head and just play it. Close your eyes, you won't know the difference.
Okay. Cool.
So, gentlemen, we're getting close to where we should at least be thinking about moving towards a wrapping up of this conversation. And I always love to throw it back to my guests to say, is there a topic or a question that you were hoping we would address today? Normally I have one guest. Today I have 2. So I got to give you a little extra time. But Jan, Steve, if you could both maybe say, is there something that you were hoping that we would address today? And we'll give it a few minutes to talk. Or you can say no.
Go first.
Yeah, go for it.
We've been cycling around this topic in various ways, but maybe just to address it more pointedly, I was expecting to talk more about gear acquisition syndrome, which was one of my research projects where I spent quite a lot of time and done research on understanding fellow musicians, be it guitar players, but also other instrumentalists, because I think we learn a lot when we compare ourselves to other musicians, because this just gives us a moment to reflect on ourselves and to compare. So maybe we can just open this topic very briefly before we close.
Do you want to give a little statement on gear acquisitions syndrome from your perspective, Jan, to get this going?
Yes.
Then Steve can respond.
Maybe more like an opinion piece. Just in the tech setup, we were talking about gear acquisition syndrome, and usually when I talk with people, and it's a fairly common topic, whenever you speak with musicians and you mention, I've done research on gear acquisition syndrome, most people relate. Either they are affected themselves, or they have been, or they've completely completely can't understand this at all. But usually the expectation is that it's a negative thing, because maybe the name suggests that it is something negative. And in fact, if you go on Wikipedia and you Google for gear acquisition syndrome, I think it's under compulsive buying behavior or something. So it is already like classed as a psychiatric illness. But my conclusion to the book was that our preoccupation with technology, with equipment, can be a fascinating thing. And it doesn't necessarily have to get in the way of playing, of being a musician, when you use it alongside, when it helps you develop as a musician, when it helps you achieve what you want to achieve. And maybe even doing sound design might be what you want to do. Maybe you don't want to stand on stage and shred a solo there for the audience. So there are very many valid ways of being a musician, of being creative, and technology can be a great thing to accommodate this creative pursuit.
Steve, what do you have to say about that?
I mean, I wrote the foreword to Jan's book on gear acquisition syndrome, and I think it's a really fascinating study. I think it's an important issue to come up with because it deals, or to address, because it deals with such fundamental aspects of like what motivates us to want to, own these things and hold these things and play these things, and you hear the stories about like the vintage collectors who just buy the guitars because they're museum objects. And, that's one type of the gear acquisition syndrome. And then there's the other type where it's just like he who dies with the most toys wins, right? And it's, I think there's a question like, is there anything wrong with that? I mean, as Jan says, like there actually are questions about whether there's a mental health condition around this. But I don't think you have to necessarily stigmatize it in order to kind of use that issue to raise some fundamental questions. A moment ago we were kind of questioning like what actually makes a guitar, but I think there's another parallel kind of question where it's just like, why do we value this thing as much as we do? Like for guitarists, like the guitar is like often the most prized thing that they own, right? But what is it? What value do we put in owning, right? Like and how much is the ownership based on a kind of use value, which like I own this guitar because I like to play it. I like to use it to express myself. I have a few different guitars because they have different sounds. They have different tones. I have some pedals because they allow me to achieve a certain vision in my head of like how I want to sound, versus like the drive to just have as many options as possible because they are there and it's a thing that you want. And I myself am very much not a gear acquisition syndrome driven person. Like my gear collection is pretty modest, I would say, especially where things like pedals are concerned. I often, though, I will admit, have a certain amount of envy for some of the folks I see who have like the collections, so I think it's a really pivotal issue to think about, to kind of get to the core of like, why do we care about these things as much as we do? What are we ultimately valuing about them? Are we just valuing them for their thinghood? Or are we valuing them because they give us some capacity to express ourselves in a particular way?
Yeah, great. First of all, I'm in the guitar industry, and I got to tell you, nobody in the industry wants me to solve this problem. No,
Go figure.
Just to
right?
be clear. Shh. Jamie, if you know the answer, please shut up. No. It's a fascinating thing, but I think we are often searching for that new stimulus. A little bit is probably is a hit on a treadmill, to be honest. There's a little bit of that. If I can achieve this, I will then be satisfied. And, as the hit on a treadmill has at least theorized, if not proven, you'll be satisfied, but for a short period of time until you'll look for a new kick. And there's a certain amount of that keeps happening. There's this iconization of so much of these things. When you talk about the collections, I think we're talking about acquiring the icons at that point in time. You're supposed to have a certain amount of this, and this. And once you have all of that, if you still want to collect and you're really involved in the collection and you're you're enjoying talking with other people about that, then you start to look for the things that once you have what everyone has, then you start to look for the things that no one has. And that's usually the space that I live in. I live with the really unusual pieces. As a matter of fact, I met you guys through Ulrich Teufel. And, Uli's instruments are pretty much the space that I live in, instruments in this sort of area. And there's a lot of thinking around projection of persona. I think when people hear that I play guitar or make guitars or in the guitar industry or whatever it happens to be, it changes their perspective on who you are. Like almost immediately. There's lots of things that someone could say to me that they are involved in or do that you might be like, oh, that's interesting, but there'd be no conversation. But often if you mention guitar, it is such an icon of our contemporary culture. It's far has exceeded the bounds of its utility. It's not about just playing the guitar. I constantly see guitars in advertisements. You see them in movies. You see them in places where you wonder, like they're selling Shega mushroom tea. Why is there a guitar in the ad? They're saying something about the culture and the iconicity. It tells you that, that we're an edgy mushroom tea maker. We're not, we're a bit rebellious, and it causes you to think differently about them. And so the guitar is a bit of clothing and expression also. But also we're talking about value, right? So, when you're talking about the collecting, I mean, there's no better way to say you value something than to put your hard-earned money and your value. Like there's a literal dollar value on this. And so I work to build resources and then I invest and acquire resources. And there's certainly something to be said about that as well. So I think there's, two main aspects to this, which you identified, Steve, is there's the collecting of the vintage instruments or the icons, the design objects, whatever they happen to be, important moments and important objects that reference something else. And then there's the possibly hedonic treadmill. I need a new drug, as Huey said, that goes there also. And this, but I think on the upside, we can also say that there's, we're painting outside the lines. And maybe there's a certain amount of us that are just looking for new possibilities. And we're looking for stimulus that we haven't yet had. And new instruments are the possibility, and new equipment is a possibility for new moments of expression. Yeah. Yeah, and I think that you can wrap that one if you want before I pass the same question over to Steve.
I think that was a beautiful summarizing statement that you just made. Nothing to add.
Steve, is there something that you hope that we would talk about today that you...
I guess I would bring up a question or an issue around like the guitar and identity, which we've kind of addressed in different ways, but I don't know if we've like hit on so squarely. And so what I'm thinking of is, in our book that Jan and I put together, one of the things we thought a lot about was how do we want to represent this instrument that there's already so much representation of? And so part of that was about who should write the chapters. And part of that was about who should be written about. And I think those questions are really essential as we have now a whole history of this instrument. And that's partly a history of its production, but it's also a history of its performance and its use, and of how it's been represented. And so I think about the fact that, we have a couple of different chapters in our collection about women guitarists, for instance. And there's been a lot of discourse in the industry in recent years about like the extent to which women might be a growing demographic that has really gone largely unrecognized through much of the instrument's history, and how that might change. And you have magazines like She Shreds, which is now a little off. I don't think they're in circulation the way they were, but for a while, I think they were kind of shaking things up a little, like kind of making a point that like, hey, there's a whole dimension to guitar culture that really nobody's been paying as much attention to as they should. And there are still some other publications like Guitar Girl and such that are out there. And within the sphere of like innovative guitar performance, I think of someone like Yvette Young, who has just risen in such a compelling way, and who has such a singular style, and is also involved in this constant process of self-reinvention, in which her identity is so much at stake, right? Like not just the fact that she's a woman, but the fact that she's just thinking about what her relationship to this instrument is, and I think some really profound ways that it sort of defines her, but like how it defines her is always changing a bit from one project to the next. So I think that question of how the guitar plays into these questions about identity on many levels, like on the level of like who identifies with this instrument and why, on the level of who we think of as being most identified with the instrument, and then like how important is it to maybe change some of that. I think on all of those levels, I feel like there's a lot of work to do to really understand what place the instrument occupies in this larger culture that we dwell in. And that's definitely something I've dedicated a lot of my time and work to.
And do you have something to expound on that, Jan?
Yeah, just maybe along those same lines. When we were designing the book, we were thinking of also geographical location. That was something we were really keen on. And we found it quite difficult to have various parts of the world represented, different parts of Asia and Africa in particular. So I think we might tend to be more like focused on like the Western discourse, and we're missing out on like other perspectives on the instrument and on reception. That's something maybe to bear in mind. And the other one, maybe worth mentioning in the same context, is the whole ecology or the ecological aspects of the instrument. Obviously, we've just talked about gear acquisition syndrome, and it's like a fun topic. We've talked about like various ways of how the instrument can develop, and but these are like more serious matters to the instrument that might also be need to be considered. How we go forward in an ecological and sustainable manner as musicians and also within the industry. So I think some of the discussions, they might change in the next years and decades, away from just like what can we do with the instruments, what is authenticity, more towards larger societal questions like those of representation, as Steve was indicating, but also sustainability and ecology concerns.
Interesting. Well, let's see what we can do here. So I get asked often by NAMM when I'm curating the Boutique Guitar Showcase, because the Boutique Guitar Showcase at the NAMM show, the guitar makers also have to arrive. And they ask me if I can invite more female guitar makers to be a part of the show, because they're concerned about these issues. And I do invite female guitar makers to the show, but never because they're female. I invite them because of their guitars. So it's a guitar showcase in this context. The instruments and the work is what we're talking about, and everything has to be a unique world-class instrument that contributes to the conversation of the guitar. And there are a number of female guitar makers who fit this description, but I never, ever, ever invite them because they're female. I always invite them because, wow, you did something really unique with that guitar, that your design, your approach to what you're doing. However, when I've looked at this on a broader scale, the part that I can't see from the guitar making, designing side of things is if you lined up all of the guitars in a row and did a survey of people and said, please tell me if this guitar was made by a male or female each time. I don't think anybody could tell you which ones were made by who. So the thing is, I don't see any female guitar makers making a guitar that is ostensibly different because of their femininity. And actually, I kind of would like to see that because it would be something interesting and something new, but it doesn't exist. It's just not out there. There are companies who have made an effort to do so, and their effort to do so is to make a pink Stratocaster with a Hello Kitty thing on it, which is which doesn't really belong in the Petite Guitar Showcase, to be honest. And so I would love to see something, but honestly, I don't see the expressions of gender so far, anyways, in the making of the craft of the guitar. And so I would be happy to talk about it if I was seeing it, but I'm actually not seeing it. And it's not because there aren't female guitar makers. It's just they're not expressing that part of themselves in the instrument for whatever reason.
Cedar Creek Custom Case Shop is your premier fretted instrument custom case maker, and we invite you to create a musical instrument case unlike any other, one that's unique to you. Every Cedar Creek custom case is hand-built by highly skilled craftspeople using only select woods, Providence Forge hardware, and premium instrument-friendly materials. At Cedar Creek Custom Case Shop, we are dedicated to helping you design the case of your dreams. Find out more at cedarcreekcases.com. Are you serious about the business of guitar? Then you need to join us on Patreon. We're building a future where guitar makers are able to live prosperous lives making instruments that inspire the musical experience, which helps to create a more beautiful world. Where others who are passionate about the guitar can thrive, those who help in the promotion and resale, trade shows, writing of books and articles are supported as a valuable part of the community. A community where we explore with curiosity and encourage those around us in their endeavors. With a community effort, we can accomplish far more than we can individually. So let's be serious about your guitar business and join us on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Jamie Gale Music. We are better together, so let's do this together. I love where we've been, and I'm excited about where we're going.
What do you have to say about that?
Well, I don't know that that is a marker of the fact that the identity doesn't matter, because I think that precisely what I was trying to raise is the question of like how the guitar contributes to the sense of identity that the player or the maker or whoever brings to it, right? So what I do think is the case, I mean, you can contest this, but I'll put it forward because I feel like there's a pretty overwhelming amount of evidence, is that through much of the instrument's history, it has been pretty squarely associated with male players, male users, male manufacturers, whatever. And so I think just recognizing, as it sounds like you do, that there are women who are part of this world is important. Then asking the question of like, what do they bring to this world? I mean, if they bring to this world like craftsmanship and, refinement and the same kind of creativity and sensitivity and sensibility that their male counterparts do, that's significant in and of itself, right? They're participants in the community. Recognizing them as such is valuable. Whether they feel compelled to do something that's more feminine, I think that's a different kind of question. I agree with you that like the stuff like Daisy Girl, I mean, Daisy Girl has its place in the world. I think it's, it has opened up a certain kind of market that might not have existed otherwise, right? We're not looking to them for innovation in design per se. It's innovation in marketing and branding, which is different. But I think I'm trying to remember, I've been actually through various parts of this conversation, I've been trying to remember, I'm not going to remember the name of this guitar maker who I saw give a talk a couple years ago. She came to the school that I worked at previously and gave a really compelling conversation. She's somebody she's a woman luthier, who does work in sustainable guitar design. So this is getting back to something that Jan was talking about a minute ago.
Rochelle Rosenkrantz.
Yes, exactly. Right.
If you know about a weird guitar, I probably know about the person. That's
that's exactly who I was actually kind of half hoping if I kind of gave you a few cues, you would like pick up on that. So thank you. That's awesome. Right? I mean, what she's doing is amazing as far as I'm concerned. I had never seen instruments like that before. Is it because she's a woman that she's doing that? I wouldn't say that. That's reductive.
Yeah.
But she's a female guitar maker who's thinking outside the box and pushing the envelope on what a guitar is and how it should be thought about. To me, that itself is worth acknowledging, right? I don't think you have to then say this somehow is her instrument is itself related to her femininity. I think the sheer fact that she's there and doing that is enough. And so it's on that level that I think it's important to just acknowledge that like guitar culture is more than we've sometimes thought it is. It includes people that we haven't always seen.
Yes.
I mean, in a different register.
I mean, to be clear, Rochelle was on the cover of my magazine. She wrote an article for me. I was on a Harvard panel discussion with her as well. She's been a part of the Boutique Guitar Showcase. So, as I said, I do invite female guitar, but it had nothing to do with her being a female. It had everything to do with the fact that she makes really interesting guitars, like mycelium guitars.
Totally.
You know, fascinating pieces. Yeah.
Totally. But I mean, another dimension of this, which I've been thinking about a lot in relation to the current project I'm doing, there's a lot of mythology around Fender amps for all kinds of reasons. But like one of them is like there's certain people who worked on those amps who are seen as having really contributed a lot to what made them so distinct. And some of those people who worked on those amps were like this group of Mexican-American women that Leo Fender hired into his shops in the 50s and 60s, right? Now, I don't think the fact that they were women has anything to do with the quality of the amps that they made, but their labor has been mostly like invisible and forgotten about for a lot of years, right? And so to recognize that it was actually a group of women who were making these things that are essential to guitar culture as we know it, I think that changes the stories we tell about the material. And that has some consequences. It doesn't mean the stuff itself is any different, right? Material is the same thing. But I think if we understand who made it and how they came about making it, that adds another layer to our understanding of what these things are.
Okay. And so you also talked about here, I have it highlighted, one of your questions. So considers the electric guitar's global circulation, particularly in Africa, the Afro-Caribbean, and Southeast Asia. And so this was a part of what you talked about as well, and the distribution and who was it playing. And this has been a part of my thinking recently also as this most recent NAMM show. And in recent days, I'm also an executive advisor and consultant to a number of companies within the guitar industry. And we talked about what I saw at the NAMM show and what I've been hearing in conversations in the last 1 or 2 years. It's different. There's a lot more talk about guitar in the Middle East. There's a lot more talk about guitar in India. And I have been noticing there's actually a very interesting guitar culture in Southeast Asia. There's some really ripping blues guitar players down in Indonesia, which is really fascinating, actually, and like really interesting, really good and fascinating. There's a guitar maker, Ethan Mulia in Ivy Guitars, who him and his brother have a metal casting company, and so he's a metal worker, and he makes guitars in a very unique way from his metal casting, and often building his culture and religious stories and stuff into the aesthetic of the guitar. That's really quite beautiful. And so tell me what you've been thinking about as far as the electric guitar and, well, Africa, Afro-Caribbean, and Southeast Asia.
Well, I mean, you mentioned that there was some amazing blues in Indonesia. There's also a huge metal scene in Indonesia, right? I mean, like really big. And I think one of the things I'm really curious about, and I imagine you probably know more about this than I do, but again, it's a question of like, what are the stories we tell about the guitar and how can we like, are there other stories to tell? I want to know more about who's making guitars in these places or how much they are making guitars in these places. So like we had in the book a really great chapter on the guitar in Africa, and it talks about Ghanaian guitar, and gosh, another country that I'm spacing on right now because it's late and whatever. Anyway, but the stories of how like these musicians even got their guitars is kind of really revealing in its own right. You know, like guitars weren't being made in Africa for the most part, or if they were being made by like, you know, players themselves, and they'd maybe like get a hold of a guitar and then they'd like rebuild some stuff. They'd tinker the way that people have tinkered throughout the history of the instrument. Like Les Paul was a tinkerer. So are a lot of these musicians who get access to guitars in countries outside of Europe and the US, where they don't have as many resources. So you kind of have to be creative. Like if you want a guitar to do a thing, you have to make it do the thing. But I think there's so much still to be known about how guitars are making its way to the hands of players in those parts of the world. And the extent to which there are local guitar industries that are forming in those areas, and if they're not forming, why are they not forming? Like that's a question I have. And you know, by the same token, there are places like Japan where there have been guitar industries that have been very productive for decades now, but I feel like we still don't know that much about them. I mean, when I was doing some of my research for our book, I was trying to like get more information about Japanese guitar making. There's like one not very good book about the topic. And it's really like the only book that I could find about the subject of Japanese guitar manufacturing. So it was like, why aren't more of those stories being told? I mean, obviously there's certain manufacturers like Ibanez who now are very well entrenched and nobody questions the quality of their instruments and such. But the stories aren't well told. So I feel like, you know, it's one thing to just know that Ibanez is a good guitar maker. It's another thing to like have an idea of what's the history of that company and like why did they evolve when they did, and how did they kind of shift from being, I mean, this is the story I think around a lot of makers outside the US, the shift from being primarily imitative to being a maker that actually is doing stuff that is their own thing, right? I mean, early Ibanez guitars look a lot like Gibsons and like other brands. And at a certain point, that stops being so much the case. So to me, those others, you know, expanding the kind of geographic idea of where the guitar is associated with is also just understanding better, like how it's become the thing that it is.
It's the expansion of American culture, I think. The places that have the most developed guitar cultures were actually part of the Allied forces in the Second World War, to be honest, and then where American military bases were established. So there's actually a strong guitar culture in Germany, Jan. Electric guitar culture. That's what I mean. There's a guitar culture that comes out of, pardon my pronunciation, I always have a hard time with this, Machneukirchen, is that right? It's really hard thing for an English person to say, but there's a very strong guitar making culture, non-electric, that started in Germany long before the American military bases. And the same thing with Japan. You know, I have a teacup at my home in Canada that on the bottom of it says Occupied Japan. It's labeled Occupied Japan. And I think that rock and roll and blues and American music and then the electric guitar came in with American military bases to Japan, to Germany, and into parts of Southeast Asia, obviously Vietnam, Indonesia, and Korea. All of those are actually post-Second World War is when rock and roll exploded. It's when the electric guitar exploded. And there was a high American presence around the globe, and it's those spots that have established guitar markets to this day. Of course, there are some other spots, but they didn't have the same type of. It's one thing to see a passing television show or hear something on the radio. It's another thing to have a group and a culture of people who are living there. I remember the first time I landed in the Frankfurt airport and rented a car. There was an African-American woman, so I thought, an African-American woman behind the counter renting me the car. And I said, "Oh, how long have you been in Germany?" She's like, "I was born here." I said, You have a Brooklyn accent. Yeah, my parents are from New York. Like, oh. So she grew up on an American military base in Frankfurt. She looks like an African-American woman. She talks like an African-American woman from Brooklyn. She's never lived in America. Her parents were from there. And that's a part of the reality of modern German culture. Jan, you can tell me if I'm wrong on this part here, but I think that's where the injection of the strongest developed marketplaces that are outside of the English-speaking world are Germany, they are Japan, and the northern parts of Europe as well. And I think it's American military.
That sounds very plausible. And
Yeah.
I mean, the military, there's also so much evidence of how much, military innovations in technology contributed to various innovations in electric guitar design and amp design as well, right? I mean, those two things went hand in hand, have gone hand in hand almost since the beginning. So yeah, I think there's a lot to that.
Yeah. Yeah. And there are a couple of South African guitar makers that are making very small quantities, but very high quality. Cassimi Guitars, an acoustic guitar company, and Murray Kuhn, who's more of an experimental guitar maker, is based in South Africa also. But these are in such small numbers that it's not surprising that people don't know about them, but they really are remarkable. They're well known amongst the guitar makers of the world, let's say.
Cool.
And so, gentlemen, thank you so much. I'm going to throw one other topic towards you because your book is about the electric guitar, and then we're going to wrap this up. I have been giving a talk on the unwritten future of guitar for many years. Of course, the guitar continues to evolve, and the talk continues to evolve. But I was last year asked to present at the Fretboard Summit in Chicago in their Acoustic Cafe section by the Gallup School of Luthery. And I realized in the Acoustic Cafe at the Fretboard Summit, I should probably turn my electric guitar references. So I talk about all guitars, but I should turn those electric ones and just sort of work on the evolution of the acoustic guitar. And there's something that I came up against that I had to deal with. And that is, you cannot arrive at the modern acoustic guitar without the electric guitar. The modern, what is often called the fingerstyle acoustic guitar, is a synthesis of a Martin and a Stratocaster. The playing, the virtuosic players like Tommy Emmanuel and Andy McKee, Manelli Jamal, all these players, they're actually all electric guitar players who moved on to acoustic. They had a different expectation as to how a guitar should respond, how easy it should be to play. They're not opposed to being plugged in to perform. So you can get that action super, super low. You're not concerned about the acoustic performance of the instrument quite so much. It's a hybrid, it's a synthesis. And then the acoustic guitar has evolved in that direction. Much more sensitive, much faster, much higher fidelity of the instrument overall. So you cannot arrive at the modern acoustic guitar without the synthesizing of the electric guitar. And I want to say this about the electric guitar. The electric guitar came to be as a way of somehow evolving and making the acoustic guitar louder, which we talked about earlier on. I know there were other reasons for it, but the primary impetus for this had something to do with mimicking what we would call an acoustic guitar. Otherwise, we wouldn't call it a guitar at all. Like, it is somehow meant to be an iteration of an acoustic guitar, and most likely we were trying to make it sound as an acoustic guitar box does. And we still haven't done it. And so, yet we have these categories of acoustic guitars and electric guitars, and I think the lines are blurred. And so why specify electric guitar, and why are you so damn prejudiced against the acoustic guitar? Why are you about diversity of place and gender, but you don't give the acoustic guitar any space, gentlemen? What do you think? Why are they separated? And can we arrive at the electric guitar without discussing the acoustic guitar?
Yeah, do you want to take that to start? I mean, I could probably come up with some things to say, but
Yes, it's an interesting question. Well, Not quite sure. I've usually approached the topic from the perspective of distortion, just because I've been a rock guitar player or blues, anything that is distorted. And for me, it was always a marker of identity, as we've discussed before. So when I was studying guitar, I was always stressing I was studying electric guitar performance. And which was tied to musical preferences. But what you were saying makes complete sense. And I haven't thought about it this way. So,
well, I've been thinking for a long time, and I came up against the problem having to present in an acoustic environment last year. So I'm not surprised, but I thought it was an interesting thing to throw back at someone else to see how they respond to it. Steve?
You know, it's funny because I'm remembering a conversation I had with a guy who's been a curator of this really cool archive at Middle Tennessee State University for many years. And we met like sitting at a bus stop outside of a conference 20 years ago. And I had just finished my first book on the history of the electric guitar. And he was like, oh, I'm writing a history of the acoustic guitar. And he wound up never publishing it, but it's like, there are histories of acoustic guitar, right? I mean, like there's histories of Martin and but it is a really good question. Like the electric guitar has that cachet. I think one of the things we talk about in the intro to our book, and it's something I think I've been thinking about a long time, is that at a certain point, even though the acoustic guitar is such a huge phenomenon in its own right, I think at a certain point, the electric guitar kind of became the guitar. I mean, if you look at, Guitar World or Guitar Player or Rolling Stone, they always have these periodic, like, greatest guitarists of all time. And you look at who they are, they're all electric guitarists. There's like 3 people who maybe play acoustic guitar. So it's, on some level, what you're asking is a pretty deep question. Like how did this one manifestation of the guitar, become the thing that dominates our conversation about the guitar? And at the same time, like, I totally agree with what you're suggesting about how there's an inescapable continuum between these instruments. I mean, the guitar is the guitar on some basic level. The electric guitar doesn't exist without its acoustic predecessor, not just counterpart. Like the acoustic was there first and is still on some level primary. And there have been times over the last century plus of history where the acoustic guitar has been, I think, more primary. I mean, I think you look at, say, the folk revival in the 50s and 60s, like acoustic guitars were hugely important. I mean, Dylan got in trouble for plugging in, right, in 1965. And by the same token, I think I agree with what you're saying about how the acoustic guitar feeds into the electric and then the electric feeds back. I mean, some of the acoustic guitarists that I have really loved over the years are guitarists who are unquestionably influenced by electric guitar technique. I think of someone like Michael Hedges in the 80s, who just, to my mind, was such a visionary player. Almost never played electric, but, doing things like finger tapping like Eddie Van Halen did a little finger tapping on, a handful of Spanish Fly and a couple of other pieces. But what Hedges was doing with, reimagining sort of like what you could do with the attack on an acoustic fretboard, right? And I think some of the guitarists you mentioned have sort of pushed that visionary way of thinking forward. I think in some really fundamental ways, like, questions the boundary between acoustic and electric. And as you say, like, part of that is precisely like there's not too much concern with sort of purity or the authenticity of the acoustic sound, right? Like, you can have reverb, you can actually sound like you're playing an amplified acoustic guitar and not trying to make the amplification sound totally invisible and transparent. I think I think the acoustic guitar needs to be talked about more in the same breath. Why I haven't done it? Good question. I have to think about that a little bit more. But I think that divide itself, it's a pretty crucial divide, acoustic electric, you know.
Mm-hmm.
It's another one of those areas where the meaning of the instrument really comes into focus in a very particular way.
Yeah. And everybody eventually goes back there, you know, just like when you see popular acceptance, when Metallica is backed by a symphony orchestra, you know, oh, they're no longer the alternative choice, right? And everybody eventually does an unplugged something, you know, and so I think that's a really interesting thing to think about. And as far as your global considerations, I'll give you one last little tip if you don't already know. There's a very interesting gray space in Australia between the acoustic and electric guitar. And I don't know how familiar you are with people like, there's people like John Butler, you know, Lloyd Spiegel. You know, you'll hear acoustic guitar and then you hear electric guitar solo over it, and everyone assumes it's an electric guitar. No, he's looped his acoustic, and he's got gain on his electric guitar, and it sounds like a fantastic blues sound. It's his acoustic guitar, you know, and I think that there's an interesting culture of acoustic guitar which developed, and electric guitar developed over there because of isolation. They had a couple of brands, Maton guitars and Cole Clark guitars, which acoustic guitars are very expensive to ship because of their size, you know, just volume and shipping to Australia, that they developed with a separate guitar manufacturing culture. And those guitars had a different pickup culture, and it really affected the way that people experience and play the guitar in Australia. It might be something worth looking into if you haven't already. Gentlemen, we could talk for a very long time. We're already over on our time. I really appreciate you giving me as much of your time as you have today. It's been a great first conversation. I hope it's not our last conversation. Thank you for being on Life with Strings Attached.
Thank you. This was a lot of fun. Great talking with you.
So if people want to know more about your work, Steve, where can they go to find a central source for you?
Well, probably my University of Huddersfield webpage is a good first stopping point. It has, you know, a pretty thorough list of my publications and such. And you can find links to a lot of the books and some articles and such that I've done. Yeah, I'd say for a central source, that's probably the best place to look nowadays.
Okay. And Jan, do you have your own website or the same answer? Or?
Yes, I've got the university profile, but I've also got a website which has some publications there that are openly accessible, and everybody who's interested can go there. It's janherbst.net, so just my name and .net.
Okay, wonderful. All right, gentlemen. Thank you so much again for being on Life with Strings Attached, and until next time, bye for now.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching and listening. You can find more episodes wherever you listen to your podcasts, and a special thanks to those who support us on Patreon. It's your support that enables us to do this work.